Food moves through our digestive system through a series of voluntary and involuntary mechanisms. So, something like chewing is obviously voluntary. We choose to chew our food. When we're talking about movement through the large and small intestines, that's obviously involuntary. You can't control the movement of food once it's in your intestines. Swallowing is getting the food from your mouth into your stomach. And so that's what we're going to go over now. Just a reminder before we start, peristalsis is involuntary. It's the wave-like propelling motion that pushes food along our digestive tract. It's what I just mentioned in terms of the small and large intestines, but it's also going to occur a little bit in our pharynx and in our esophagus, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The way that works is that contraction in the muscle occurs right before or right behind the food in order to push that food forward, and the wall ahead of wherever the food is relaxes so that the food can move forward. So swallowing is going to occur in 3 stages. The first stage is often called the oral phase, and this is from the mouth into the pharynx. The second phase or stage is the swallowing reflex, and it occurs within the pharynx. And then the third phase is the esophageal phase, which obviously occurs in the esophagus. So we look at the first phase. This is the voluntary phase of the swallowing mechanism. The food is chewed, it's mixed with saliva by our tongue, and our tongue also rolls food up into a little swallowable ball called the bolus. The bolus is then pushed into the back of the pharynx, the oropharynx. We'll go over the parts of the pharynx again in a minute. And so now the food voluntarily was pushed to the back of your throat. At this point, there's going to be a reflex. So this is, again, a feedback loop type of reflex in which it's not exactly a feedback loop, but it's that type of reflex in that you have sensory receptors are going to send the information of pressure of food in your pharynx back up to your brainstem, and then that is going to then have you carry out this reflex. When the food is in your pharynx, when it's sensed that it's in your pharynx, the body is going to automatically push that food into the esophagus. In order to do this, the nasal cavity and the trachea are going to be sealed off, as well as the mouth, and muscles are going to push the food downward. When we look at this in more detail, we'll look once again at the 3 parts of the pharynx. So you can recall that it is part of the pharynx is a part of both the digestive and the respiratory systems. So you have the nasopharynx, this top part, that's what came from the nasal cavity. You have the oropharynx, which is this part here that comes from the mouth or the oral cavity. And then you have the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx has 2 openings, one that goes to the trachea and one trachea via the larynx, and then the other one that goes into the esophagus. So when we look at this phase 2 pharyngeal part of swallowing, the swallowing reflex, it's important to remember these 3 parts of the pharynx. So because we have 3 parts of the pharynx, we need to seal off the parts of the pharynx that we don't want food to go into. So this means we're going to have our soft palate, includes the uvula, it's going to go up. This is going to block off the nasopharynx because we don't want food going up into our nose. We're also going to have our tongue press against the roof of the mouth in order to prevent food from going back into the mouth. Then thirdly, the larynx is going to tighten so that the glottis is closed. The epiglottis comes down over it, and this is going to prevent food from going into the trachea. So the nasopharynx is sealed off, the oropharynx is sealed off, the part of the laryngopharynx that goes to the respiratory system is sealed off, and this leaves only one spot for the food to go, which is down the part of the laryngopharynx that is attached to the esophagus. Once all of that is closed off, muscles in the wall of the pharynx are going to contract. They're going to pull the pharynx upward towards the food, and the muscles ahead of that are going to relax so that the esophagus can open, and peristalsis is going to force food into the esophagus. Lastly, once the food has passed into the esophagus. Peristalsis is going to transport this food into the stomach along the length of the esophagus. So if we look at that just one more time, you're going to have the tongue uh, take the chewed food that's been mixed with saliva into a bolus. It's going to push it back into the oropharynx. Here in the oropharynx, we're going to seal off the opening to the mouth. We're going to seal off the opening to the nose, and then we're also going to seal off the opening to the trachea so that the only opening left is to go into the esophagus. The pharynx is going to come up so that it meets with this bolus, and peristalsis is going to push us into the esophagus, and then peristalsis will continue to push that down the esophagus into the stomach. There are 2 videos that you can watch on YouTube if you have more questions. They're linked in the PowerPoint, and they're also found in the digestion playlist on our YouTube channel. There's one here, which is where I took most of those videos from, and then there's one more here. So there are 2 that you can go